The agenda this week considered the problem of extreme emotions in politics, debated the cost of nuclear power, got financial advice for common law couples, and heard why how you pay for things changes how you feel about those purchases. The agenda's Week in Review begins with a look at Justin Trudeau's first year as Prime Minister. I want to start, Stephen Gordon, to you first in Quebec City. What would you say 1 year later is the status of the honeymoon with the Trudeau government?
Well, politically, I'm not better informed than anybody else, but it looks there's not any reason to think that anybody is regretting their decision. Pretty much what they was promised, at least in the economic front, has been delivered, and I don't think people are upset about it.
Althea Raj, how does the honeymoon look to you from Ottawa?
Yeah, I disagree with that. I think there are a lot of people who are not super happy with the government. This is not the government they thought they were voting for. Indigenous Canadians, many of them who look at the Site C dam decision, who look at LNG, who look at the government's reversal on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, feel that they expected a different relationship from the Prime Minister who promised a nation-to-nation relationship. Same thing for environmentalists, who I think expected a lot more, and young people too, I think, to some extent. So I think the honeymoon obviously is still on. I mean, you look at public opinion polls, and the Prime Minister is, up well over 50%, in some surveys over 60%. So I think that you can say that the honeymoon is on, but the voter coalition that brought him to power last year, I'm not sure is going to be there for him in 2019.
Michael Taube, we had a discussion on this program the other day in which somebody suggested Justin Trudeau is the most popular leader in the world right now. How does the honeymoon look to you?
Well, how would a Harper speechwriter or an X1 look at it? You know what? The honeymoon still exists. I would agree with that. Obviously, as Althea pointed out, and she's quite right, the popularity numbers are still very, very high, and they've actually escalated in the past year. So Canadians are obviously content with what they see in the first year of this government. Naturally, for most of us, it's sort of what we expected, especially those of us who didn't vote for him, the 60% plus who didn't. We didn't expect a great deal from this government in its first year. We are not surprised by some of the things that have come through. Yes, Stephen Gordon is right that some of the promises have been kept, including ways that they dealt with the 3 consecutive federal deficits. We're already in one, which we've combined into one, which is quite extraordinary, but we'll get into that later. But on
just so we understand that, they promised a $10 billion deficit over 3 years.
Over 3 years, and they almost hit 30 in the first year.
Right, so they did all 3 years in once.
All 3 years in once. But let's be real, but also I think we have to look at it in terms of what the future will be. We can't determine after 1 year where things are going to go. When I worked for the Harper Tories, I couldn't tell you how the next 9 were going to go. But at the same time, I think we're looking at a period of time where progressive policies are now very much back in vogue once again, and where a selfie prime minister is more interested in his looks and appearance than he is in public policy.
I'm going to call you Stephen Marsh because we have too many Stephens on this program today.
Problem of our lives,
So
right?
Stephen Marsh, not to be confused with Stephen F. Gordon or Steve Paikin.
Yeah.
How does it look to you?
Well, I think a honeymoon is a very traditional, very old-fashioned way of looking at this. I mean, you had a person who was elected with under 40% of the vote, now is at 55. I mean, there were news reports that the honeymoon is over because he dropped from 60 to 55. You have a prime minister who does not stop campaigning. Like, he continues to campaign. He gives, I think, one interview every 2.5 days, which, of course, is the exact opposite of Stephen Harper. His popularity is, in Canadian electoral terms, ridiculous. And he's popular for enacting the policies that he was elected to apply. So I think, all in all, it's pretty massively successful first year. I mean, I would take Althea's point. The native issue is the one true sticking point. But other than that, you have the census that has been reinstalled. You have the Syrian refugee issue. You have carbon, the first real step in carbon taxation federally, which, is a huge step forward environmentally. I think we have to take things all in all, and it's pretty impressive.
Here's John Geddes writing in Maclean's magazine recently about this. Looking hard at the workload of Justin Trudeau's government can be like peering into a dense thicket of promises. He made about 200 of them in last fall's Liberal election platform. Some he's kept, and a few he's broken. But of course, most of those policy pledges remain after only about a year in power, works in progress. Althea, I think there are something like 150 consultations currently happening between the Government of Canada right now and all of the different sectors slash stakeholders slash people with interests in a variety of issues. These 150 consultations are going to descend on the Prime Minister's desk in the next few weeks. And I wonder how in heaven's name he actually begins to govern once that dump takes place.
Well, I think in some cases they have an idea of where they wanted to go. They just, after 10 years of Stephen Harper, the bureaucracy wasn't really used to proposing things to the ministers' offices that the ministers' offices accepted. So I think they wanted to reach out, not just in the bureaucracy, but in civil society and get experts who are outside of government to sort of feed the government information. And so they wanted to make the best public policy decisions possible, obviously with their ideological frame of mind there. So I think that it's understandable in some cases. It's not just procrastination. I think it is understandable in some cases that the government has sought to establish all these consultations. The other reason we have so many consultations is because we actually have a cabinet, a government by cabinet, as opposed to just being a prime minister who makes decisions on all the files. And so if you empower your cabinet ministers to go off and you give them an agenda, yes, it can look a bit confusing and chaotic from the outside because they have so many different messages and talking points and policy areas of interest. But you also, it's natural that you would have all these consultations because there's far more things that the cabinet ministers are interested in. Where does that leave the Prime Minister in terms of decision making? Well, I mean, a lot of people are not going to be very happy. C-51, for example, the Prime Minister, when he was leader of the third party, campaigned saying that there were a lot of problematic elements with C-51. A lot of young people who gave the Liberals their vote in the last election thought the Liberals were going to do something about that. Punting it over for further study, I'm not sure was what they expected. That's sort of the point I was getting to at the outset. But I don't think that it's going to be that shocking. I think the Prime Minister has already identified to us that he can make firm decisions and is ready to stick to it, whether it's on carbon tax, whether it's approving the LNG pipeline. People are going to start seeing a government that is perhaps more right of center than the Liberals campaigned. But otherwise, I don't think there's going to be huge surprises coming forward.
There is a very ugly and, to me, scary amount of anger around in the campaign. There's a lot of feeling, I think there's a feeling of helplessness on the part of some parts of the electorate. And one thing I talk about in the book is that when people feel helpless, it's very hard for them to live with that. And so often they decide to blame somebody, and it could almost be anyone. But in this case, now there's a tendency to blame Hillary, blame immigrants, blame minorities for the economic problems and the difficulties that white American working class men are facing. And there are real problems. We know that the health of white men is declining. The jobs in the manufacturing sector have moved offshore. And so the result is that people are just flailing around and wondering what to do about it. And instead of trying to solve the problem, they decide to blame. And that to me is what's particularly scary, because it suggests that even after the election, there might not be an acceptance of the result. And we're starting to hear that from Mr. Trump. And so I do feel that it's a real scary note for democracy at this point.
Let me contrast those comments with some made by Michael Barone, the journalist, some 25 years ago, who said, when referring to Pat Buchanan, the populist Republican who was running for president back then, Pat's going to go nowhere in politics because Americans aren't angry people and they don't trust angry people with power. So as you fast forward 25 years and you see that probably at least 40% of Americans say they're angry enough to vote for somebody as reprehensible as Donald Trump, what's going on to make that possible?
Yeah. Well, see, I think Americans always were angry people. The image of masculinity was always that of a very strong, potential for anger. When Michael Dukakis, whom you may have forgotten about, ran for president, he lost the election basically because he didn't express enough anger on national TV when he was asked what would happen if his wife was raped. He had created a prison work release program that resulted in one rapist being let go.
We remember Willie
And so
Horton
he
in
was asked about that.
1988.
Willie Horton. You remember Willie Horton. Well, he just, asked that question. He responded rationally and calmly, and that was the wrong thing. I think Pat Buchanan didn't go anywhere because at that stage, Americans were welcoming of immigrants. And when he came to Chicago to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade on an anti-immigrant platform, people said, "What do you mean? We're all immigrants, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, etc." And so that just didn't go anywhere. But right now, unfortunately, with the loss in working class employment, there's this feeling that jobs that are so-called ours, I mean, the white working class men think jobs belong to them and they shouldn't be taken by women, they shouldn't be taken by African Americans, and they certainly shouldn't be taken by any kind of Latino immigrant. That's the change, is the great suspiciousness of immigrants.
I suspect, though, that on this side of the Great Lakes, we have always looked south, sometimes with admiration, but certainly always with the notion that America was the land of hope and opportunity and all that. And I wonder whether your students in Chicago still manifest those hopeful views.
Well, I wish I could say that they did. I think that instead, so what we see on the part of younger people is a different kind of anger, but it's also, I think, not very productive, which is in the followers of Bernie Sanders. You see, I'm not going to talk about Sanders himself, but a lot of his followers, a kind of utopian anger, like let's smash the system and let's destroy the banks and let's start all over again, that is just as doomed and just as unproductive as what you get on the right. And so these words are hurled about, socialism, this and that, and the bad banks. And, the fact is one of the nation's most admired founders, who's now being a hero on Broadway, was Alexander Hamilton, who created the central bank. And so people are cheering for Lin-Manuel Miranda, a great genius of the theater, who created this play about Hamilton. And yet they're saying, let's smash the banks, let's destroy the centralized economy. And so it's a very weird and I think ultimately very unproductive kind of anger on the left.
Well, again, as we look from this side of the border, you want to talk weird. I cannot recall a campaign where the sexual histories of the current Republican nominee and actually the husband of the current Democratic nominee appear to be everyone's obsession with 3 weeks to go. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, it's retaliatory. That is to say, what Trump says and has apparently done is highly relevant to his being the president of a nation more than half of whose citizens are women. But then he responds by hurling mud at Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton, everything has already been gone through. He was impeached but not convicted. And besides, he isn't the candidate. No one stops to say, hey, wait a minute, Hillary is the candidate. And there's something extremely sexist, I think, in the perception that, of course, she's really a puppet of her husband. No, she isn't. She got better grades in law school, if the truth be known, and she was always a highly intelligent and ambitious person, and now she is the candidate. And what she has done, apparently forgiving her husband, is between the two of them. I think people should have a little bit of privacy in their relationships, but I guess I think that, sure, he's an imperfect person and that's well known, but the fact that she has gone through that and she is loyal to him and she has forgiven him is her business, and it's, I think, to her great credit that she's capable of generosity and forgiveness. But it doesn't have any bearing on her. It's simply because there's nothing Trump can say about her personal sexual conduct that he decides to go after the husband. But that does betray a sexist perception that she's really just a puppet.
$12.8 billion for this refurb at Darlington. Why does it cost so much?
Well, as you saw in the setup piece, it's a very complicated job. It's a huge capital project. It's a major plant. It's an extremely robust plant, highly engineered. It takes a very highly skilled workforce to complete this work, and the workforce is comprised, as you saw, of highly skilled trades. This is a big capital project. Big capital projects cost lots of money.
So that's the cost of doing a nuclear refurbishment. Satine, if you were going to compare that to, say, building a gas plant, how much would that cost?
Gas plant in capital cost is certainly cheaper. And in that sense, and you can do it faster too in terms of a project timeline. The issue with gas is that you're subject to fueling costs, so the fuel and the volatility of gas prices as part of the equation of the decision you would make around whether to build gas for the long term or something that's capital intensive.
So if you're
like
going nuclear, you've got more price stability then than you would natural gas, which fluctuates depending on the market price.
Nuclear provides a very solid foundation over the long term in terms of stability of both prices and in the emerging world now with respect to carbon, a low carbon footprint over many years.
I think we built our first nuclear power plants in this province 50 years ago. I think it was the Robarts government that decided to do Pickering.
Yes.
So we have 5 decades of experience on this. Has the province of Ontario ever done, either in its old incarnation through Ontario Hydro or the new incarnation with Ontario Power Generation, a nuclear build on time and on budget?
In the sense that there's always a delay in some of these construction projects is well established. I mean, the idea that these are complex engineering projects and so there have been delays and one can go. In fact, Darlington, if you think about it, its early history when it was under construction was delayed, went above cost in many ways, but has proved over time to be a real success in terms of the cost of its output and what it has provided to the province of Ontario over the last 2.5
Well, let me
decades.
follow up with Steve on that. I think the original price tag on Darlington was something like, what was it, $1.5 billion, $2 billion, something like that? It ended up at 13?
It ended up at 14. The original was 7, so it went double its cost. But as Jatin was saying, it's absolutely worth it. I mean, it ended up coming in double the cost, but it's still one of our lowest cost power producers. 20% of the power of the province. That's an enormously important plant.
Angela, next question to you then. OPG, Ontario Power Generation, insists $12.8 billion is the budget, and they will bring this project in on time and on budget. Should we believe that?
Well, I don't know why we would. Every nuclear project in Ontario's history has come, on average, over budget by 2.5 times. Why would this time be any different? You know, OPG originally has been saying all along the cost for the rebuild will be 7 to 8 cents. Just last month, they came before the Ontario Energy Board and asked for a 180% increase in the price in the price they receive for nuclear power, from 5.9 cents to 16.8 cents. So they've come clean and said, actually, it's going to cost 16.8 cents, and that's even before cost overruns. So no. The Darlington rebuild is definitely not in the economic interest of Ontario tax and ratepayers.
Don't want to get too far down the road on that because we're going to come back to that, but that's what they've asked for. The Ontario Energy Board has not granted that request yet, have they?
But they haven't, but that's what they're saying it's going to cost to extend Pickering and rebuild Darlington.
Well, that's their ask.
Yeah.
You always ask for more than you're going to get, don't you?
Well, actually, no. They always under budget. They underprice what it's actually going to cost.
Okay, Mark, over to you. Should we believe them when they say they're going to be in on time and on budget?
No, absolutely not. I mean, when I started as a lawyer here in Ontario, I was at the demand supply plan hearing, which was a big environmental assessment hearing in 1991-92, just up the street here. It was a 2.5-year process, and Justice Connor, some fairly highly reputable jurists were on the panel. And, you know, after 2 years, and there was cross-examination at the time, it was evidence, the entire nuclear plan fell apart. They were going to have, by 2012 was the plan in 1992, that they would have these 2 new reactors. And they had predicted that natural gas would be about 3 times the rate it is now, which is one of the reasons they were going to build nuclear plants. Of course, natural gas is now at 50-year lows. We hadn't built any plants in 20 years, and we haven't run out of energy. In fact, energy is cheaper than it's ever been. And post the DSP, we had what were called demand supply plan hearing. The Ontario Energy Board did yearly reviews. They were called hydro rate reviews. And I was a counsel at HR, Hydro Rate Review 19, right to Hydro Rate Review 25. And they were canceled by the Harris government in 1996. But we used to go into those hearings. There were 3-week hearings every year. And the numbers would come in, and they were not ever supported by evidence or scrutiny through the process. So once the hearings disappeared, we lost that. And most of these numbers I see now are just pure politics. They're just thrown out there without the public having the opportunity to test them, to cross-examine them, or to determine the reliability.
Tell us why you believe, because I presume you do believe, that this project can be brought in on time and on budget.
Well, just because they've done so much setup and so much practice at it. The earlier refurbs, like the only one that we can say that we can tag with a bad overrun was the Pickering Unit 4. Pickering Unit 1 came in reasonably on time and on budget, and the Bruce ones, well, there was some force majeure at work, and they were delayed, but not, to a
Force
great
majeure,
degree.
meaning?
Meaning something beyond our control. This was invoked. It was accepted by the authorities. And if you go back to what Mark was saying, yes, they might be wrong. Everybody's wrong in their projections. But what was the upshot of them being wrong in the early 1990s was nuclear power is still our second cheapest power source. It's the biggest source of power in the province, and it's still the second cheapest. So they got a few estimates wrong. Everybody does. It's not egregiously expensive. The alternatives are egregiously expensive.
No, but I appreciate that we are highly dependent on nuclear power, and that as a cost per kilowatt hour of electricity, it's still quite a competitively priced thing. Yes. Having said that, if you tell me you're going to build something for $7 billion and it ends up costing $14 billion, tell me why I would want to go back to you and have you do this new project for me.
Because it produces 20% of the province's power. It was delayed by a couple of years, but in the end, you get 3,200 megawatts of flat-out baseload power that runs 100 days at a time and produces absolutely no carbon and has the smallest environmental footprint of any form of power generation that we know of.
You studied how the experience of paying for something affects our happiness with the purchase. What'd you find out?
So what I found out here was that cash, which feels more painful, psychologically painful, when we pay, could have some added benefits. Namely, that when we spend, we feel that this pain, we ask, well, is this pain something that could be quite valuable to us? And why is it that I actually bought this thing and evoked this pain? And so in fact, then we say, well, maybe it's because I really valued this object. And so while pain could be a bad thing at first and paying cash could hurt, it actually helps in the long run because we value whatever we've purchased more. We care for it. We feel more committed and more loyal to it.
So the flip side of that is, if you pay for something on credit, presumably it's too easy, barely noticeable, and therefore we care about it less?
That's precisely it.
Huh. Now, you said painful there.
Yes.
What kind of pain are you talking about when you make a purchase?
Right, so I'm not talking about a stub your toe type of pain or this emotional duress, but rather the psychological pain of parting with your money. Obviously, we like things that are free, and so anytime we part with our money, it's money that's now taken away from us for a particular good. I want to buy this water from you, for example, then even if I pay a quarter, that's a bit painful because it's psychologically distressful to
part with
our money.
Always?
Always. I mean, it makes us feel better if, for example, we buy something that we like, or maybe we buy something for a friend that we care for. So that's certainly the case, but at least in this particular context, it's more painful to spend money than it is to save it.
Is there something constructive about that pain, in as much as perhaps feeling that pain prevents us from being completely irresponsible when it comes to buying things?
Absolutely. And so I think there's these two benefits. One is the one you just mentioned, that then you have this pain, so it might prevent you from spending. You might think twice and say, well, maybe I could be spending this on something else, or maybe I don't really need that coffee or that pastry or that extra pair of shoes. But on the flip side, and this is the work that I've been working on, is that, well, then also that pain, if we condition on making that purchase, it could act as a cue of something that we care for. This must be because I care for this. And so we actually value that purchase more, and again, we feel more committed to the organization or the brand that we've purchased on behalf of.
We mentioned a bunch of different hierarchies, I guess, of spending off the top, everything from credit to cash to tap to this, that, and the other thing. When you look at this thing, is there a hierarchy of pain in as much as this is the most painful, second most, third most, least most painful, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the continuum I think about is you think about cash is the most painful. And cash is more painful because that's the form that we grew up with. So you can think if I grew up in the US, and so Canadian money at first felt a little less painful than my US cash. And vice versa if you're Canadian.
So when you're handing over the George Washingtons and the Abraham Lincolns and the Benjamins,
I like to.
the Ben Franklins are
That's
the most
right.
painful.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct
Yeah.
too. Is that the bigger bills are even more
Yeah.
painful than that.
But
Now
some of
I'm
the-
trying to affiliate with Canadian culture now, so I'm starting to go away from making sure that I care for that Canadian money.
So
since
for up here, if it's a Robert Borden up here, that's troublesome.
that's troublesome, totally.
Because he's on the
troublesome.
100.
That's right.
But the
Yeah.
Queen, not so troublesome.
Not as troublesome, certainly.
Okay,
That's correct.
I'm getting the picture.
So cash is the most painful. It's the form we grew up with. Next on that list, you would think of the check. Check is painful because you have to write in the amount. Then you also have to write it again in that little payment window. And so that rehearsal process creates that increased saliency of knowing exactly how much you spend. Next on the list is what I like to bucket as plastic. So you have debit card, credit card, gift cards, prepaid cards. And that's less painful because it's like just a quick tap. The tap is the same thing for $5 as it is for $100. And so that tap makes it now convenient, but it's also less painful. Then finally on the last end of things seems to be very interestingly, and what you mentioned at the top of the just a few minutes ago was the mobile payment, online payment. Because there, the phone is your communication device. Your computer is your work device. So now we're not even associating these things with money in the same way we did with the other forms.
If one makes a purchase with a debit card, that money is vacating your
Same
checking, saving account, whatever, right then and there.
Right.
If you're buying on credit, it might be 30 days away before you have to worry about it, right? Is there a difference in pain levels given that reality?
So theoretically, yes, there should be, but I've done about maybe 30 plus studies on this given topic, and I have not been able to find a difference. It seems that that actual medium itself creates this difference, and not that what we call intertemporal aspect of saying, well, I spend here, but I'm borrowing from this future because I don't have to pay for, let's say, 30 days. So I can't seem to find this difference, but I guess theoretically you're absolutely right that it's not even money that is in your account at the moment or that you even have to take away from your account. So it feels costless for that particular moment. But I haven't been able to find this particular thing.
Is it a given that if the item you're purchasing is more expensive, it's going to be more painful?
Yes, I think that is true. And so if you, for example, spend $20 for something instead of $10, then it's more painful.
But is that to say that the purchase of a house, for example, will be more painful than the purchase of a car, which will be more painful than the purchase of a book or a vacation or whatever? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, again, I think this goes back to we might feel more value or pride in it because we've spent all this money.
Yeah.
It's very consistent where there are some psychological theories, one called cognitive dissonance and another one called self-perception theory. And both of them basically say when we go through these painful experiences, we immediately want to convert them into value and where we care for it. So people have studied this in the context of like hazing, for example, or if you're paid money to do something that you don't find like unethical or things that you don't find to be palatable. But it's very consistent with this notion. So with a house, for example, you might say, well, I paid all this money. Toronto house prices are crazy right now.
Yes, they are.
So there's $1 million, for example, and I spend all this money. Well, it must be because I valued it quite a lot, and that's why. So we might not, we immediately might feel that pinch of payment, but then immediately over a little bit of time, we might then construe that as a valuable experience. That's because my roots are here and I care for this.
A lot of theories why people move in together. Fire away.
From my experience with the clients that I see often, yes, they're in love and it's great, but also there's a lot of financial benefit to moving in together, especially in urban centers. It's a lot cheaper when you are splitting rent, but it still feels like your own place, right? So yes, you have a roommate, but it's somebody that you get to decorate yourself and that kind of thing. So in my experience, people are cohabitating a lot. Like weddings are expensive. So they're testing it out first before they invest all of that money in the big day. And also it's a really fast way to split your expenses. And so there's a lot of impetus for people to move in potentially even too soon.
Let me pick up on that. Judith,
Yeah.
I mean, in your experience, is this more of a financial transaction as opposed to deep love?
It's hard to know. I mean, the problem I have is that most people talk to me about this when it doesn't work out, right? So they don't come to me, which they should, at the beginning and ask about, well, what are the implications of moving in together? You know, what are there legal things, or am I making assumptions that I shouldn't be making? So, you know, really, I'm getting them at the wrong end. They should be coming and talking to me sooner.
If they did come in beforehand to ask for your advice, what would you tell them?
Well, I think for sure I would want to check in on assumptions, because a lot of people think, and it's great if you live together and you're saving, but you know, sometimes these relationships do go longer than the 4 point whatever years, and people have kids, and all of a sudden the relationship isn't working out, and they've been together 6, 7, 8 years, and they've made assumptions about what they get to share afterwards. They think, oh, after 3 years, I get all the same benefits I get if I were married.
Is that not the case?
No, it is not the case. No. So they're a big sticker shock for these people when they come in.
Okay, Shannon Lee, if people were coming into you for advice before shacking up, what would you tell them?
Well, I don't do the legal stuff, but what's interesting is that I always say, hey, you should sit down with a family lawyer and get a cohabitation agreement. It's one of the first things that I'll tell anyone to avoid potential conflicts down the road, which I've seen. From a financial perspective, I think both people need to out themselves completely with what's going on their finances. So, you know, get financially naked with each other, so to speak, and just how much do you make? What's the debt? Where are we coming from? And that's when you can really start building a plan together from the financial point of view anyways, and you actually know who you're moving in with at that point, so that there's no surprises down the road. And then when you're starting to make a budget with all of this new savings, you can do equitable sharing instead of equal. That's one of the big things with moving in together that I see as an issue from the financial point of view.
Judith, obviously if you're getting married, you call it a prenup. So a cohabitation agreement, is that basically the same thing if you're going to live together?
It is. And unfortunately, though, as Shannon's saying, it's all very well to sit down and talk together. But when you start talking about a cohab agreement, then it's, oh, well, I have to go to this lawyer, you have to go to that lawyer. And all of a sudden, people are not too interested. They feel like they're already starting off on the wrong foot. Kind of the same as with marriage contracts. Although there's no reason, and actually some of my collaborative colleagues and I do see couples together when they're thinking about separation, just to give them information. And there's no reason we couldn't do that, in fact, with people that are thinking of living together, right? I mean, because there's a lot more to the relationship than sharing rent, really.
Totally.
Yeah.
And if you, again, we have two sort of concepts here that we have to presumably follow as you do this. One is to make the agreement equitable, and one is to make it equal. What's the difference?
Well, from my point of view, it's the equitable part comes in when we're actually dealing with like the bills and how we're splitting it. But there are ramifications of that on the other end, especially if there's assets involved. Like one of the big conundrums, which I flag for people and often say, like, this could be something that you want to flush out with a lawyer, is when one person owns a home and then people move in together, but they aren't married, but they're contributing to the household the same, I would say that's when you want to flush that out, because I mean, rent is one thing, but if there's assets involved upon breakup, there are huge ramifications to that.
So if you're going to do a cohab agreement, are we talking about stuff as simple as, you know, who's going to be mostly responsible for the hydro bill, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it could be, but it also might mean, you know, are you going to contribute to that home if you're not entitled to it? Because when you break, if you break up, oh dear.
As opposed to when.
Yes, exactly. Then, you know, you may have no share in that house, or you may have a legal battle to get a share because the legislation doesn't automatically give you the share that you would have gotten if you're married. So, and support is another issue, right? I mean, because you know, if they're sharing, but one of them is paying more than the other, so is kind of supporting the other one, then that could trigger obligations. So while they may not share property at the end of the day, they may be building on support obligations. So that's another huge issue that, you know, could come back to haunt someone.
What's a time period that you have to be living together before all of the legal implications of what you've talked about kick in?
Well, there is no time for property because you basically don't get to share it unless you want to sue somebody in court under trust stuff. But for support, it's 3 years if you've been living together and been supported during that period, or 1 year if you have a child together. So it really telescopes the time down, which is, you know, not unusual if you have a child together that someone may not be working or may be on mat leave. And if things break down at that point, there'll be a support, not only child support, but possibly spousal.
So once those time periods have been checked off, so to speak, cohabitating, married, same thing essentially legally?
Well, for the support issue it
terms
is,
of
but
support.
not on the property. That is the big message I think that I'd like to leave people with today, that do not assume that you get all the benefits of marriage when you come to property sharing, because
Gotcha.
you do not, no.
How common is it, Shannon, for non-married couples to buy a house or a condo together?
I'm seeing it often, especially because in a market like Toronto or even outside where it's more affordable, again, when you combine finances, you have that much more purchasing power. Maybe you have two people coming to the table with money for a down payment. So what I'm anecdotally seeing with my clients is get together, rent, buy a house, then plan the wedding. Like it seems to be going like the down payment and the house pieces first. So I'd say it's very common, especially within the millennial group, because people want to get in and get the market. And if they feel like this is the person that they're going to be with forever, the wedding can wait, because now there's not the same stigma about moving in together. So let's take care of business first, and then we'll get married because we'll have the party later. And so when we think about marriage like a party, then we don't do it first because we want to take care of what's important, which might be buying a house. So I'm seeing a lot of that.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on the YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.